This is Season 5, Episode number 2 of the Performance Nutrition Podcast, and today's conversation is a fascinating one. I'll be talking about the phytonutrient content of meat. Yep, you heard me right. Those plant chemicals like carotenoids, phenols, antioxidants that are taken up by livestock when they're grazing on grasses actually become concentrated in the meat and the milk. My guest today, expert Dr. Stephan van Vliet from Duke University, is going to take us on a deep dive around this whole topic of unprocessed meat, phytonutrients, and the impacts on our overall health. It is a fascinating discussion. Make sure you don't miss it. Stephan, really appreciate you taking the time today.
Yes, thanks so much for having me, Mark. I'm excited.
Yeah, well, listen, I think listeners are going to be really excited about the topics that we're going to dive into. A lot of nuance to unpack and really fascinating research that you're doing. But before we jump into that, maybe can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got to your role?
Absolutely. So I graduated as an Aspen Fellow from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I did my PhD in kinesiology. A lot of our focus was on protein metabolism, muscle protein metabolism, particularly in response to whole food ingestion. That field it was mostly studied in response to isolated proteins, so I focused heavily on that. Mm-hmm. After that, I had postdoctoral training within the Center for Human Nutrition at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. And since the last 2 years, I've been at Duke University School of Medicine, and it's really here where my research focuses heavily on the nexus of agriculture and medicine. So I'm trying to combine these two fields, looking really at food production systems, whole food sources, the whole food matrix, and the complexity and the nutrients that they contain, and how they impact human metabolic health. And in my work, I work together with farmers and ecologists, agricultural scientists, but also medical doctors.
Yeah, I mean, it is just an absolutely fascinating area because this is, for someone who's passionate about nutrition and human health, to sit in the position that you're in where these things are all coming together is really fascinating. And it's sort of the future of being able to prevent a lot of these chronic conditions, right?
I agree, because being at a medical school, I always feel like we're studying most of and treating people with diseases that are rooted in dietary origin. And instead of doing it after the fact pharmacologically, I think we should look the other way and look at the way that we produce our food. And maybe we can improve that and improve our production systems and obviously also our dietary quality. But it makes a lot of sense, at least for me, to combine these two fields, agriculture and medicine, because that's ultimately what we're after, right? Like treat it prophylactically rather than pharmacologically afterwards.
That's just it, isn't it? I mean, it's a lot cheaper to do it if you just prevent it from happening in the first place. And even before we jump in, I'm curious, being European and obviously the food systems in Europe, very different than North America, myself being from Canada, Are there any initial reactions when you first came over to the US or things that come up now when you think about the different systems?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely thinking about, I grew up in the Netherlands, and we're very heavily on dairy production and also have a lot of that going on. And where I grew up, I didn't grow up on a farm, but I grew up near, I would ride my bike. That's what we do in the Netherlands. I ride my bike for a couple of minutes and I'll be in farmlands and always seeing cows on pasture. And I also would buy my milk from local farmers and things like that. And in the Netherlands, for instance, to give you an example here, in the Netherlands, it's very common and by law are Gouda cheese, which is world famous, right?
Yeah.
In the Netherlands,
my wife eats it all the time, man.
Exactly. And traditional Gouda cheese, for instance, here in the Netherlands, has to be made according to a traditional recipe. You cannot pasteurize the milk, for instance, to make it. Yeah. Whereas here, for instance, in the US, it's like
got to do it right.
Yeah, exactly. So these are definitely different systems. It's good to look at this from, that's one advantage looking at it from a European standpoint and the US standpoint, where you get these different systems and it gives you an open mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how just being able to view things from a different lens, even if it doesn't contribute large amounts to what you're doing, you're able to just see things slightly differently, which can make all the world of difference when you're trying to solve some of these complex problems. And diving into your work around meat, dairy, we typically think of micronutrients and key micronutrients, calcium, vitamin D, iron, these types of things. When we think about the benefits of consuming these foods, we don't tend to think about phytochemicals when we think about these foods. Can you talk a little bit about that, the phytochemical side?
Absolutely. So in our work, we use metabolomics approaches, which is basically allows the researcher to look at a broad variety of metabolites that are in various food sources. And then we go on to feed people these food sources and look at their metabolome profiles, either postprandially or after several weeks of consumption. So, and what we found here, and especially when we started to several farmers too, is that we found a large variety of phytonutrients in these food sources. In this case, in meat and in dairy. And what we found is that when animals graze on very phytochemically diverse pastures, that a lot of these phytonutrients do get incorporated into the meat and milk. And it is interesting because obviously we usually have a very reductionist approach to nutrition, right? We think of like you said, the protein, macros, fat, vitamins, minerals, yes, and these appear on our food labels, and that is what we think of as a food source. But food sources in a natural state may contain up to 10,000s of unique metabolites.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? I mean, that's just like, it's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it is, and this reductionist approach, these single nutrients and single food studies, right? That's mostly, and that's also I think why we often have these discussions about these sort of black and white discussions, like saturated fat is bad, or meat is bad, or plants are good, and it is much more complicated, than that. So really taking this approach, and I must say we're only scratching the surface on this. So even the more I dove into this, the more I realized that we know very little about these compounds and how complex food sources are, which also means that it's hard to replicate these food sources more. And we can get into this later, maybe with like alternatives and things like that, if we can replicate the original product that we're trying to do. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing when you think of just the level of your knowledge base already to get to where you're at, and then to go into this domain and then just feel like you're scratching the surface on this just giant amount of information that's unknown. Really does put things into perspective around that idea of having a bit more wisdom around some of these things, not assuming that we know so much. Sometimes it's, especially when the general public listens, it's almost like we think we know, we've got all our bases covered, right? We got the macros, we got the calories, everything else. And obviously those are big players, but there's still so much to be known. And, you talk about, anti-inflammatory, anti-carcinogenic, cardioprotective properties, and some of these compounds like, terpenoids, phenols, etc. And so it is confusing for the public and even for the practitioner, to be honest, around, we get these messages that we should be reducing meat consumption for some of the, things that you mentioned there around saturated fat intake. And we have associations that then, propagate these messages, which are, one side of group of experts would say that this is evidence-based, and yet you have another side that would say, well, this isn't evidence-based. This is, a little bit too myopic. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's definitely now a large concern about both the environmental and human health effects of red meat. And a lot of this, at least from the human health perspective, is based on epidemiological data, where we associate single foods, in this case red meat, with deleterious outcomes such as heart disease or diabetes, obesity, you name it, and it has been associated with it. An important part is that I think diet quality is an important portion there, because if you can see on some of these studies, like the Healthy Shopper studies, or the Oxford EPIC cohort, or the Albertus Tomorrow project, what you can see is that once diet quality increases, you see that these associations between red meat and human health largely become neutral. So there is obviously this concern with that people that tend to eat more red meat also tend to exercise less, tend to eat less fruits and vegetables, tend to maybe be of general less healthy lifestyle factors. So those are definitely important nuances to recognize, and it is often true that, and also supported by randomized controlled trials, that when consumed as part of a wholesome diet, potentially also rich in fruits and vegetables, some of these associations may disappear. And we know this from mechanistic data too. The combination of, and I think the French were up to something when they drank a glass of red wine with their meat, right? Like including some of these polyphenols, and including herbs and other plant foods, fruits and vegetables, and eating them in combination with meat also can make some of these mutagenic compounds, or these they can render them mostly ineffective and reduce their issue. So don't want to say that there's no potential issue with eating red meat, but I do think that diet in which this is consumed is a huge modulating factor. And this is not uncommon. This is always mankind, where we offset maybe the bad of one food with the good of another food, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even traditional cultures eating clay with their potatoes so they get rid of their toxins. I mean, you can draw that parallel to red meat and fruits and vegetables too, where you combine the two, because obviously from animal foods we do get a plethora of nutrients that are not just beyond zinc, vitamin B, iron, but also some of these extended compounds, some more complex terpenoids like squalene or cysteamine. Cysteamine is, for instance, an important precursor to glutathione, which is a main antioxidant in the body.
Antioxidant.
Yeah, and we know about thaurine, for instance, and anserine, which are very important for cognitive function and play a central role in many cellular processes. And these are exclusively found in animal source foods, and especially for young children and for cognitive development, that those things can be important. So, while arguably, yes, we can reduce our red meat consumption in Western civilization, there is a need also to make sure that this stays balanced, and obviously also has to be looked at in the context of overall dietary patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you touched on a few things there. One of them is, I mean, in Europe, if you're in France or Spain or Italy, you're always eating meat with vegetables, with salads, with veggies, with olive oil, sometimes with a glass of wine. Whereas oftentimes when we think of the stereotypical North American meal, it's sort of like steak and potatoes. And, if you watch any sitcoms, it's always the dad doesn't eat any vegetables at all. And that's kind of the running joke of trying to get them to eat more vegetables. So there's that whole piece to it. And then there's also that part of processed versus unprocessed meat, right? I mean, in terms of actual, if you're having beef or a steak versus, heavily processed sausage or hamburger, can you touch on that and how that changes the story?
Absolutely, no, Mark, and it's good that you point out that even there's a nuance within the processing, because even in some associative data, and this is more out of like, for instance, I'm thinking about this cohort in Morocco and some other North African and Middle Eastern countries, where you actually, this is also observational data, but where these traditional processing techniques like salt fermentation versus nitrate curing, for instance, which is what we do generally in a sort of a modern industrial setting, but doing more of a traditional processing of the meat, it's actually not associated with some of these negative health outcomes of red meat. So even there, you could say, yes, processed meat, but are we looking at the meat itself, or are we looking at more of these modern processing techniques, right? Because a lot of these more modern techniques that we use, such as nitrate curing or some of the additives that we do to get this that are found in processed meats, right? Yeah, those can alter the healthfulness of the product, and most of our modern ways of processing are for convenience, their efficiency, but they're not necessarily in the best interest of our health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think to your point, previously around, when we talk about we do need to consume less red meat, let's say, I mean, if we think about all the factory farming and all the, that's being used for fast food. And, when I think of places to start where two groups that are not in agreement can find a point of agreement, you'd think that whether you're a vegan, plant-based, or whether you're, I don't know, carnivore or paleo, you can sort of agree that, hey, the factory farming and the way that we're treating animals there, and even the quality, if you're strictly just, let's for lack of a better term, call it selfish and say the quality of what you're getting is also, poor and substandard, right?
Yeah, no, that is true. And to get back on some of the findings that we made, and this is often not recognized when we talk about grass-fed versus grain-fed meat. It's myopically focused on omega-3 fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acid. And admittedly, there are some differences there too, but when you really look at this extended pool of phytonutrients, such as terpenoids, polyphenols, carotenoids, tocopherols, things that people often think of are exclusive to the plant kingdom.
You say those terms and you just think plants right off the bat.
Yes, exactly. And I must admit, also was initially a little bit surprised when I looked at our data, and I was like, oh, man, there's a lot of plant compounds in there. Yeah, I have to double check on this data. I did some grass sneak in there, but no, the grass snuck into the animal, obviously. And what we noticed is that some of these compounds that have no known health effects, they are actually upcycled into the meat of the animal. And for instance, if you look at terpenoids, for instance, we know that 60% of all natural products that occur are terpenoids, and these are things that have, like I said, anti-carcinogenic effects, anti-diabetic effects. And what we actually found was that these occur in substantial amounts in the grass-fed meat, and they often remain indetectable in grain-fed meat, or at least much lower. And it's the same found in milk. And then when I went back into that literature, I actually found a large body of literature, especially done in France, and some of it was in French, but that already established. Yeah, that's the golden rule in science, right? If you can think of it, there's a good chance someone else has thought of it too, and has found it in some other way. Actually also found that that's really when you start seeing these large differences where think of it as that one of the farmers that we work with, their animals, they consume about 100 different plant species to 150.
Wow.
And a lot of plants that we cannot access, right? Grasses, forbs, shrubs. And so these are some of these important nuances when people say, well, why don't I just eat plants to get phytonutrients? It's a little bit of a black box at the moment, but one of the things that we should think about is that we can access phytonutrients potentially through that middleman, the animal, whether we consume it as meat or dairy. We can access phytonutrients that maybe perhaps we are otherwise unable to readily access when we consume meat that was raised on phytochemically diverse pastures. And there's also some work to suggest that when animals, and this is obviously what often people think of, is that this healthy soil, healthy animals, healthy humans connection. And there's not a lot of data to suggest that right now.
Okay.
And things that we're working on, but there is some data to suggest that if animals graze on nutrient-rich soils, that the actual nutrient composition, such as even the B vitamins, such as riboflavin and thiamine, can be higher in these products.
Yeah, I mean, it's in reading your paper, I think one of the lines around the amount of plants that there are, I don't know if it was North America or in the thousands and tens of thousands, and then the amount that humans can actually break down and digest effectively. I mean, it's just minuscule compared to all the various types of vegetation. And then you think, to your point, over millions of years of evolution, we have this middleman who, four stomachs helps as well, right? You've got these ruminants who are taking up these, chewing on grass for 12, 14, 16 hours a day and able to upcycle these things. And so can you touch on that, just that biological circle, and how, and today there's, again, absolutely benefits to reducing meat intake, but there's a narrative around the Eat Lancet study, and we just need to go completely plant-based, and that's going to solve all of our problems.
Yeah.
The pendulum seems to really swing from one side to the other versus trying to get into the nuance. Can you talk about that?
It is often black and white, these messages, and that's what makes it hard. Though I must say, I think also, I cannot speak per se for Eat Lancet, but I do think they see some role for regenerative agriculture and integrated crop livestock systems based on some recent conversations with some individuals involved. But in any case, yes, I mean, those are important things, and it's not per se that we have to use every bit of land or for grazing. And another thing I want to highlight is that the idea that nature and agriculture are somehow separate entities, I think, is also something we should move away from. And in that case, but what I think is important that and we see with some of the farmers that we work with, they're able to cut costs by integrating crop and livestock systems using modern technologies. Because we went to monoculture systems where farmer A would produce corn, farmer B would produce grain or wheat, and the other farmer would produce dairy, the other farmer would produce meat. But actually trying to integrating this and reestablishing these linkages can help both, I think, livestock production and crop production if we integrate these into modern farming systems. And that is really what regenerative agriculture is built around. It's nutrient recycling. By having manure from animals, fertilize the plants, we can reduce pesticides that way. We can reduce external fossil fuel derived
big one.
Inputs, such as fertilizers. There's self-sustainability of feedstuff where the animals can graze the crop residue. So these are ways in which this can be incorporated. So it doesn't have to be per se crop or animal farming per se. And in the same vein, there's synergy between maybe plant and animal production, but in the same vein, there's also synergy for humans in consuming both plant and animal foods, providing different but also synergistic nutrients.
Yeah, it's amazing how it becomes this dichotomy of almost like you're going to eat only plants or you're only going to eat animal protein, which is sort of ridiculous because we're by nature omnivores, and virtually everyone on the planet is an omnivore. And so we get into these discussions, and I like the nuance around, in your work, being able to really dig deeper into that around just how many phytochemicals we're talking about and how there's just so much we don't know, how interconnected it really is. And it's,
It is true, because even if you think of something like a plant, or think of like a soybean or a beef, they contain an estimated, and I think, like I said, we're still scratching the surface, but an estimate over more than 50,000 unique metabolites, right? So to think that one is a good replacement for the other.
Big label on the bottle for that one.
Yeah, you need a big label on the bottle for that one, and that's why if we put them on the label of some of the novel alternatives, then yeah, I do have some concern whether they if you look at a very reductionist way, then yes, they would represent adequate replacements, and yes, we do get maybe our essential nutrients in, but we know that all these other nutrients play important roles, and that it's sort of a band-aid approach, right? And we want to optimize our intakes and get the full complement of all biochemicals and phytochemicals found in foods that we know have important regulatory roles in physiology and our human health.
Absolutely. And do you, in your work, are you seeing that more now with farmers who are obviously with the groups that you're working with around the notion of being able to, as you mentioned, reduce costs, but then start to produce, multiple different types of things on one farm and go about things that way?
Absolutely, yeah. So some of the farmers that we work with here in the U.S., and they definitely, and some of these groups are, for instance, Understanding Ag, where we work with, and some local farmers that we hopefully start to work with pretty soon in North Carolina too, because we have a big pasture-based system here and very supportive. But yes, what a lot of these farmers do is they indeed stack various enterprises on top of each other, where they produce crops, they have multi-species livestock operations, where they maybe integrate beef with smaller animals like goats or sheep and chickens and pigs, and they sort of rotate around the land with animals following each other. So yeah, you're stacking enterprises on multiple pieces of land, and that it mimics agroecological principles, right? It mimics nature, because nature has introduced a wide variety of herbivores into ecosystems.
Yeah.
And we always see large herbivores, smaller herbivores, monogastrics. So yeah, that is one of the things that we're looking at, and we are very interested in linking this connection between soil health, plant diversity, and human health, because I do think that that connection needs to be made. And there's an upscaling of phytonutrients, like I said, what we see in our work, where we see these increases of like 10, 20-fold higher phytonutrients. So that's also why when we compare, let's say in this case, meat from different production systems, then that's really where you see these large differences in these phytonutrients. And that they are important, I think, is important to note, because I certainly don't want to make the claim here that we should eat meat for all our phytonutrients or something like that. And there's no benefit to plants, but it is important to note that some of these phytonutrients, they do occur in amounts that are maybe even comparable to some plant foods, like chlorogenic acid or gallic acid, and these things. They are found in substantial amounts in plant foods, and in cases they might rival some of or I should say in meat, and they might rival some of the amounts found in plant foods. And then on top of that, I want to say, like I said, we are accessing a variety of nutrients that way that can both benefit human health and also animal health.
Yeah, I mean, if we circle back to the discussion around human health and the fact that at the moment 2/3 of the population are overweight or obese, we've got prediabetes, diabetes is just chronic systemic inflammation impacting people's health, and then with that inflammatory noise in the background, the signal of exercise and the signal of good diets it's harder to hear. And so could you talk a bit about, again, the benefits when we look at some of the grass-fed versus the feedlot on how this can even impact some of these markers of inflammation?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that's very much a black box at the moment, Marcus. There, on paper, we definitely see that the phytochemical richness of grass-fed meat is much higher than grain-fed meat, and on paper it looks much healthier. But unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of work right now in humans to confirm that. One study that is often cited in favor of this is a kangaroo study from Australia, where they compared kangaroo grazed on native pastures, so
Okay.
wild kangaroo. They obviously consume whatever they want,
Yeah, there you go.
they're free-range
Nice.
animals, right? In the true form, and they compared it to Wagyu beef, which is
Yeah.
grain finished beef that is especially known to be fatty and shows some signs of early metabolic disease, like we would see in humans too,
Yeah.
from some of that work that has been done on that. So there they found the authors found a dampening of inflammation right after the meal, after consuming kangaroo. But as you can already imagine, the animal was confounded there because it's kangaroo versus beef, and the kangaroo was likely leaner than the beef, even though they cut out the fat from both steaks. This was probably an issue. And then another study, and again, a lot of it has been done in Europe, of grass-fed dairy, cheese in this case, from sheep grazed on mountain pastures. Mountain pastures are very well known to be phytochemically rich and have a large plant diversity. It was found that consuming 200 grams or half a pound a week also dampened inflammation compared to grain-fed cheese. But then again, there's also been work done at Texas A&M that showed that eating 4 grass-fed patties versus 4 grain-fed patties a week did not show a difference. Some work been done with butter, again in Europe, not showing a difference. So it is very much mixed, and that sums up about those studies, somehow the majority of our knowledge. So as you can imagine, there's not a whole lot of knowledge right now to suggest that we can at least directly say that grass-fed meat is healthier to consume. And coming back to your point, Mark, about some of these nuances and details, like I said, with the reason why we are in this crisis of obesity and diabetes is obviously not because we're not consuming grass-fed meat and we're consuming grain-fed meat, right? It's the overall diet quality that we should keep in mind. And in this case, an interesting study that hopefully we can perform in the future is looking at what if you consume all your foods from a pasture-based model, or what if you consume all your foods from a regenerative agricultural model, where maybe we increase the nutrient density of your food. That is important, but we should also definitely focus heavily on improving people's dietary quality, irrespective of whether we're talking plant or animal.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if we took a North American population, if you just feed people more real food, then if somebody is overweight, then you're going to see weight loss because caloric intake is going to go down. You're going to get improvements in glucose control. Inflammation is going to come down. And so, I can appreciate if we just swap one thing out of the diet, as you mentioned, in some of these studies, we're not seeing it, but as you mentioned, that kind of, if we look at it from 30,000 feet, if we're eating more real food, then we're likely going to get those effects. And, to your point, when we look at Spain, I mean, they're going to be the longest living people by 2050. And, they consume above the 10% saturated fat mark. The French consume above it. I mean, these are all populations that live longer and have fewer heart attacks than the recommendations that we're getting. And so that notion around diet quality, can you talk a bit about, saturated fats and that importance of diet quality, how that becomes a part of that story?
Yes, for sure. I mean, even within saturated fat, some of these associations, if you look at more whole food sources like dairy or beef or chocolate for that matter, some of these associations, when you look at the whole food sources of saturated fat, then again, you start to see that these associations largely become neutral. So those are important things to know too, that definitely the matrix in which these are consumed, that we refer to as the food matrix, that is definitely important to highlight, and therefore like messages of saturated fat are bad per se, obviously are a little bit more nuanced. But then again, on the other hand, I mean, maybe current intakes of especially like very long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids like omega-3s, right? There we generally see a benefit when you substitute those, for instance, fish eaters. But at some point, that is also gonna top out. But that's also, I think, why now with associative data, you can generally see some of these advantages for swapping out saturated fat with more unsaturated fats. But like you point out in the Spanish and the French, then yes, there's definitely a paradox there.
There is, and even just the saturated fat from junk food. I mean, that always seems to sort of get a pass in terms of all, the tonnage of, when you look at the intakes of saturated fat in these countries, I mean, the vast majority is coming from processed junk food, which sort of seems to get a pass almost, or we sort of just, and then we focus on a food that has, the protein quality, obviously the micronutrients. Now we're talking phytochemicals. And so on that bigger picture of diet quality, it does become a bit of a, I guess for the general public, it just becomes a distraction, because you see so many people that come in that are avoiding foods. Like, I don't want to eat steak, so I'm going to go for this other alternative. And it happens to be this pre-prepared, processed, calorically rich, carbohydrate rich, and it's like, we're making things worse than easier by the explanations that we're giving to folks.
Yeah, I agree. It's the reductionist approach to nutrition, and it's reductionist messaging, and always associating single foods or single nutrients without respect to like diet quality, and linking those to health outcomes. I think it's definitely problematic, and there's a shift now slowly towards more dietary patterns, where also in my field, scientists realize that we should study dietary balance. And you also see it with the dietary guidelines for Americans, that there's more attention being paid now to dietary patterns, or we talk about Mediterranean diets, Okinawan diets, or you name it, traditional Nordic diets. What do all these diets have in common? Despite the fact that they are very much different, what they have in common is the diet quality is high.
So they don't eat crap.
They don't eat crap.
They eat very little of it.
Well, we make it very complicated, when in reality it is fairly simple. The message only is, how do you get people to do that? Obviously, with an abundance of, and it is hard. And I also don't think it's because of weakness of people. There is just so much abundance of processed foods, and with marketing and messaging, you just generally see that you're being bombarded with it, and that's obviously hard. Even subconsciously you making these decisions.
People are working long hours, they're not sleeping, they're stressed, and it's like, of course you're gonna, you're surrounded by all these options, and unfortunately it's the default option for most people. And circling back to something you mentioned there before, I mean, one of the reasons around the European side, I always feel like in North America, it's easier for us to get swayed by the different dietary fads, because although there's obviously a lot of second generation, we don't have that really strong cultural, it's hard to change things in Spain or Italy when people are just, this is the way we eat, and this is, we'll listen to a little bit of that, but we're still going to do what we do. And you see that holds a little stronger, whereas in North America, we tend to be a bit more open to this diet or that diet, and to the expense of then being infiltrated with just more processed food becoming sort of just the norm. I guess
we were currently running a randomized controlled trial where we're looking at more of a whole foods based dietary pattern versus a processed food dietary pattern. The study is fairly new. We started it. We had to shut it down because of COVID for a while. So we started it up again in October, and we're finishing our first participants. But we're looking at it from an energy balance standpoint, because I'm sure you're familiar with Kevin Hall's work at the NIH that showed that people, if you give them processed foods, they overeat. And that's largely why people think that processed foods are bad. Well, what happens if you consume it in an energy balance and you maintain weight? Are they de facto bad for our health, or does it have to do with the fact that we overeat them? And I mean, obviously we know that the nutrient density is going to be compromised. So overall, if you eat it for maybe 25 to 30 years, then you're definitely selling yourself short on some of these compounds that we talked about today, right? Like this extended, because you can take a multivitamin pill and get the same amount of vitamins and minerals on a sort of a processed food diet that is not very nutrient dense, or you consume these as part of like 4 to 5 foods. But obviously we have to look at this whole food matrix approach, where we start appreciating the complexity of foods in their natural state.
I mean, it's fascinating. And one of the things I think about is around even young athletes, around the fact that they're very fit. They do a lot of exercise, but oftentimes they don't eat very diverse diets or very quote unquote healthy diets, but just the amount of exercise, building muscle mass, like these are really powerful signals that really help to offset. And, I think one could get away with eating more of a lesser nutrient dense processed food diet if they stayed fitter and everything else. It's a really thin line to walk when you're especially getting into midlife and you're not exercising as much, like things can go wrong pretty quick, right?
Absolutely, but even from that standpoint, Mark, some of our work has found that if you consume whole eggs versus egg whites, matched for protein, that you actually, and coming back to the athletes, this was done in young resistance trained athletes, and young I mean in their early 20s, that we found that if you consume the same amount of protein from egg whites or whole eggs, you actually get a higher muscle anabolic response with whole eggs, which again was not per se explained by the amino acid composition, which is very similar, but it's explained by this extended pool of nutrients that are found in the egg yolk. Several, obviously, vitamins, minerals, but also bioactive peptides that we know play an important role in signaling and in intermediaries to muscle protein synthesis. So, and pulling that back to some of the other diet in general, when you're microdosing these extended pool of phytochemicals or biochemicals over maybe a 20, 30-year lifetime, like you said, when you come to middle age, then yes, these things I think are going to matter. It will be very hard to prove in a human model that eating obviously we cannot do randomized controlled trials, we have associative data, but at least from mechanistic in vitro data, which we can pull towards maybe, at least try to interpret in the light of humans. But you could say that, hey, if we microdose these phytochemicals for 20 to 30 years, then we are probably reducing our rates of cancer and cardiovascular disease. I mean, an interesting study that came out the other day this was an in vitro model. If you treat cancer, a line of cancer cells with phytochemically enriched milk versus more milk that's from grain-fed animals, you see that the viability of this cancer cell line is reduced. So there's less cancer proliferation with these phytochemicals if you just put some milk on these cells. Now I don't want to say that per se this works. We cannot say this works on the humans, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. The spirit of what's going on.
Into the spirit of what's going on there's a possibility indeed that higher dietary quality and microdosing these biochemicals and phytonutrients over a lifetime, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, reduces your risk of chronic disease later on in life. And maybe you can get away with it at a younger age, but yes, definitely in the later decades of life where you start losing muscle mass and you start to become more prone to
inflammation and arthritis. And I was going to say, Stephan, for a researcher, what lens do you view this in when we need to look at things over decades, multiple decades, yet you can't run a trial for 20. So how do you parse that out when you're trying to, we have, again, you have these concepts or mechanisms and, this appreciation for how this is going to support health, but then from a, purely scientific standpoint, when you're trying to make the points you're trying to make or uncover, prove the hypotheses, how do you map these things out?
Yeah, I think we need to look at it from multiple lines of evidence. So we have population-based data, epidemiological data, then we have randomized controlled trials, then we go further down the line and we can look at the animal data and even in vitro or cell data, right? And if all these point towards the same direction, then I think at some point we can confidently say that something is potentially really bad for our health and sort of proven beyond reasonable doubt. And so that's how I try to, or at least many of us in research try to, in academia, try to navigate this and coming back to the point of dietary quality and then some of these associations of single foods, right? Is that if we let's take the example of red meat, heavily associated with every disease under the sun in epidemiological data. Then if we look at some randomized controlled trials that are shorter term, maybe 8 to 12 weeks in length, if we consume red meat as part of like a Mediterranean diet or another high quality diet, then we generally don't see these negative effects. If we look at the in vitro cell data, if we put some herbs or some other phytochemicals on meat in an in vitro model, we see that some of maybe these deleterious compounds are not formed. To your point is that, if everything points in the same direction, then I think we can confidently say, but I also think in nutrition that we should just be more open about acknowledging when we don't know something, because even within dietary guidelines, I don't see, obviously we have to give some guidance, but we should also be able to just say, admittedly, gracefully, admit that there is uncertainty about these things. that we just are not 100% sure. And I think that's important to note. And especially in the field of academia, there's always a risk to fall into these dichotomies, and where you sort of, start to align with a certain viewpoint where it's hard to get out of it, right?
Yeah,
if 20 years, for 20 years you showed
dug
this,
the trench, and now all of a sudden you're like, Jesus,
yeah, it's hard. Yeah, when you dug yourself into a certain trench and you can't get out of it. I mean, that is hard. So I think for that reason, it is always important to recognize these nuances and just try to do our best and also admit when we're not 100% sure about things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see how they convey the recommendations, because for such a long time they were conveyed in such a manner that no regular person could ever appreciate, this amount of servings of whether it's vegetable, whether it's carbohydrate, like now we've gone to the plate system and it's just more visual. I mean, people are, again, so busy in their day-to-day lives that when the explanation gets so long, they just tune out, and it's like, okay, well, maybe next year I'll come back to this. It's like we've got to be able to get the message to people in a way that's digestible and actionable, to just get the ball rolling so that they can choose to go deeper, versus sometimes I feel like we give them all this information and it's tough to digest, right?
Yeah, and also when you start looking at like the single nutrients or single foods, like we talked about earlier, is that it gets very complicated for people. But the message itself is very simple. I mean, choose a diet mostly rich in unprocessed foods, containing moderate amount of animal foods, plant foods, and you're well on your way, and you can adopt it towards your tasting, your liking, your cultural traditions, right?
Yeah.
Like what we spoke about earlier is that if you look at dietary studies around the world, what do humans have in common is that they consume both plant and animal foods, and they can vary widely based on the geographical region, but these healthy diets all have in common, whether it's Okinawans, whether it's the Sardinians, whether it's people in the Nordic countries, in Spain, and the diet quality is high, and that's it's mostly unprocessed food. So I think that's something we should, definitely in the future start to pay more attention to. Because if you think about this also from and to look at this from a sustainability standpoint, right? Like, and these are the externalized costs of food. Yes, they are very cheap, right? And these costs don't appear on our grocery bills. But you and I, or anyone in society, they have to be paid for eventually. So we don't see them on our food bill, but we do see them in like cleaning up water supplies, or healthcare costs, our taxes, right? One way or another, the consumer will pay for it. So I think those are also important things to start recognizing, the externalized cost of food that do not appear on your food bill. We tend to choose cheap foods, but it does not always reflect the true price for society.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely. And I like the message you said there around the diet suggestions, and how you start from this place of unprocessed food, and then you can tailor it to your goals and your background. I mean, that's an empowering message for people that helps to guide them down the road, versus, it can sometimes feel like we're giving people a bunch of rules to follow, and it's like, when we look at that, performance psychologists and mental performance coaches, I mean, that's not the best way to go about things. And so I really appreciate that, that type of message. And Stephan, I mean, I really want to respect your time here today. Any other, in terms of your research around this topic, are there some other key insights you've had over the years of doing this, or, in your work that you're currently doing, that's, things that you're thinking about, or future directions to some of this research?
Yeah, absolutely. We're very interested in linking some of this work that we're doing on this pasture-raised meat, and linking this to soil health, and linking this to plant diversity, and seeing how these are all related, right? Like, for instance, we look at, does increase soil health, plant health, and does it improve the healthfulness for humans to consume? And this is not only just about meat, but it's also plant foods too.
Plants as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, we should not view these as two separate entities somehow. And some of the farmers we work with, they grow peas and they grow corn, and it would be interesting to see if these systems that are all interlinked, and that through nutrient recycling, can we increase both the healthfulness of animal foods and plant foods while decreasing the external input at the same time? And that will be, I think, that is a very exciting research topic that we're working on. But at the same time, we're also working on evaluating some of these novel alternatives. Like we did a recent metabolomics comparison where we compared a popular plant-based meat alternative with beef. look at, because the nutrient facts panel suggests that you can get similar nutrients from it. But again, we are looking at a reductionist approach here, right? Where we look at protein, fat, several vitamins and minerals.
4 or 5 or 6 or 8 things, right?
Exactly. And then they look the same, but what happens when we peel back the onion layer? So we run some metabolomics on those two, and yeah, they are night and day different. I mean, we run an unsupervised principal component analysis on it, which is basically means that you put the data in a model and they tries to cluster itself. And what we see is all the beef on one side of the graph and all the plant alternatives on the other side. So there's a large difference, and I think we should start to appreciate that, and that these may be complementary. And they can provide us key nutrients, but they should also be viewed as complementary in our diet. And yeah, I mean that market will grow, right? I mean it's inevitable. It will grow, and the same with cellular meat. I mean, again, how are we going to replicate the phytochemical richness? I'm not sure, but if it helps with food security, and I keep an open mind on these things too. I mean, technology is inevitable in food systems, but I do think that we should appreciate these agroecological systems, nature, and then trying to use modern technology to actually work with nature rather than trying to work against nature like we've often done in the past.
It does feel like intelligence versus wisdom at times, doesn't it? I mean, we're able to do so many highly technical things with technology and everything else, but sometimes, to your point, being able to kind of zoom out a little bit to just have that wisdom to say, okay, well, wait a minute. How do we mesh these two together rather than just think? Because even as someone who was vegan 20 years ago, I mean, back then I had to actually eat rice and lentils. You know, you couldn't eat soy dogs and burgers and whatever else. So you had to just eat real vegetables. And so it's amazing how the processed food is sort of coming on to the plant-based world as it did the meat-based world, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I don't know if we have the full wisdom, right? Because we pay dietitians and we have dietary guidelines telling us what to eat. But an animal, you don't have to tell an animal what to eat. So, exactly. So who's the wise one out of us, right?
It's always I was going to say, like the tiger and the leopard doesn't need a warm-up. They're good to go.
They're good to go, and they also don't need to be told what to eat, whereas we as humans do. And so those are important things to realize. And I do think we still have that innate response where we sort of intuitively know. We do intuitively know which foods we should eat and what is healthy for us and what is not healthy for us, right? We create a situation where it's really hard to sort of follow those instincts, whereas it's a gift and a curse where you can rationalize.
Yeah, the messages definitely get scrambled today with our modern environment. And I could pick your brain here all day, Stephan, and I want to respect your time. So a key message to leave for listeners, for viewers around this topic. I mean, I know it's obviously very nuanced, and we're talking about 50,000 different phytochemicals or potential nutrients in a food. What's a message that you would give, around this topic?
Yeah, that I would say around this topic of phytonutrients or foods in general, would say like mostly focus on whole foods. And when we look at, for instance, a grass-fed meat or milk, if you are able to afford this, I would say that obviously the power of the dollar it is powerful. And if you can support this, I would definitely do so. Mm-hmm. But beef or meat and milk, irrespective of how it was produced, provides key nutrients, because I also don't want to steer people away from these foods per se, that especially at certain stages of life, like in young children and in older age. Yeah. These are key important. So these are important nuances to recognize that, yes, it is important and it looks more phytochemically rich and it might be healthier to consume, but you should also buy what you can afford.
Awesome. Listen, appreciate you taking the time today. I mean, this is a really, really fascinating area. We'll include the links to the papers and the show notes. And where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your fantastic work?
On my Twitter is at Van Vliet PhD, spelled as my last name, and then also my Google Scholar profile, which you can find by just typing in Google Scholar and my name, or typing in my name, Stephan van Vliet and Duke, and you'll see several links appearing with some of our work that has been published, and also my work on Twitter. And where possible, I always try to pay for open access, so that everyone can read it. That's another negative part about science, that it's sometimes beyond paywalls, right? Yeah,
exactly. So, especially in this day and age of fake news, we need as much free open access as we can get, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no. So we always try to do that, and so that's where people can find me.
Awesome, man. Listen, appreciate you taking the time, and we'll definitely keep up with all your fantastic work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark.